Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee, getting ready to start my day. I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about a lot of the scientific literature out there and what a lot of the experts out there are noticing and have found. People like Alan Aragon, a perfect example, Dr. Eric Helms, a lot of these people with advanced degrees in nutrition who work with both athletes and bodybuilders. Yes, I separate the two. As well as just kind of looking at the scientific literature. Now, YouTube doesn't normally let me link studies in my description box, so I'll probably link a massive overview that's looked at dozens of different studies in both non-athletic and athletic populations of actual athletes. I'll probably link it in the comments below. Hopefully that should be fine. Kind of breaking a lot of this down so you guys can see this stuff. If you want to read all the data and review of it yourself, you want to spend the next 20 hours doing so, feel free to do so. But what's been noticed in the overall literature when it comes to changes in body composition during fat loss phases, the only thing that seems to really particularly matter is net calories and protein more than anything else. In other words, what remains of your other calories, depending upon where your protein is, when protein is equally matched, there's very little difference between how you choose to fill the remaining calories with carbs versus fat in terms of changes in body composition and body fat. Now, I will state that in many cases, the higher carb diets do have slightly better performance and muscle retention. But if the protein is high enough, even that goes away, right? And that's what's been noted in all the literature, that the higher protein goes, the better your muscle retention is. And what people need to remember, the higher protein goes, the higher your calories out tend to go, because that's the other end of the equation. When we talk about calories in, calories out, people say, well, not all the calories are equal. That's true. Fat can't compete with protein. But the problem is that, you have people who will try to say that and push in the direction of eating fat, when actually the literature usually shows if there's ever a bias between carbs and fat, carbs usually have a very, very small advantage in the fat loss area, which makes sense because your body doesn't have a direct storage situation where most humans can't store carbohydrates as body fat particularly easily. That's a myth that they can. That it's not been found to be true in labs under normal circumstances. We're not particularly good at it. And when we do manage to pull it off, it's not efficient, meaning it wastes a lot of calories in the storage process. Whereas in fat, stores directly. You can gain fat on a keto diet, you can gain fat. You can store fat as body fat in pretty much any environment, even with almost no circulating insulin, because it's not even a factor. Not even a factor there, believe it or not. People have this misconception that that's how it works, and it's not what the data is showing in the human body. Even the biochemistry doesn't even show that. So it's a really ludicrous idea that insulin is somehow related to storing your dietary fat as fat. No, all your surplus fat you eat in your diet is going to go directly to your fat stores. Pretty straightforward. But caloric surplus is generally required for that to happen. And what we find, macronutrient breakdown matters a lot more when you're in maintenance or a calorie surplus than it does when you're in a deficit. When you're in a deficit, your body will pull from your body fat no matter what the breakdown. Doesn't matter if you eat straight protein, doesn't matter if you eat straight table sugar, or if you drink straight oil, right? You're still going to lose body fat. Now, some of those are going to cause more muscle loss than others. And ultimately, what seems to matter is, what does your protein intake look like? And that's the problem with when people say, well, does that mean ketogenic diets are good? Because that's what always comes up. No, because ketogenic diets aren't ultra high protein. Ketogenic diets are usually 20 to 30% protein. If you're eating like 50% protein, you're not on a ketogenic diet. So when I talk about keto diets, I'm not talking about someone who's eating 50 or 60% protein calories. That's not a ketogenic diet. Your fat intake has to exceed your protein intake, in which case it doesn't have particularly good protein. And here's what we ultimately find. The lack of carbohydrates without a protein overfeeding doesn't supply you with the fuel you need for training, doesn't supply you with the extra insulin response that you need to retain muscle mass. Because that's the problem we get into. People forget is that when they start talking about insulin, and they don't understand, people who are active and athletic don't get insulin spikes from eating carbs. It doesn't actually happen. If that actually happens, you're probably like a type 2 diabetic already. It doesn't happen to active populations. It just doesn't. But what you do find is that insulin itself is more anabolic to muscle tissue than it is to fat tissue. So if you were to drive down your total circulating insulin without an improvement in insulin sensitivity causing it, meaning it's just a short-term change you did this week immediately, what you usually find is that that's going to push you in the direction of muscle loss more than fat loss, right? Because again, it's more anabolic to your muscle tissue than it is to your fat tissue, and you're removing something critical you need there. But that is made up for with protein. So in other words, if your protein intake goes high enough, you get good lean body mass preservation, even if you drop either of the others relatively low, because your body can convert protein into glucose to use for fuel. Protein has an insulin response. But the upside is to someone who, again, trying to lose body fat, protein is your best muscle sparing macronutrient, but converting it into glucose to use for your training fuel, which your body will readily do, expends energy. It's not a free conversion. It's not a conversion where your body just converts X amount of calories of protein into X amount of glucose. No, that actually requires energy, and it can be a substantial amount. It could end up being a couple hundred calories a day in some cases, depending upon how much protein your body is needing to break down into glucose. It can end up being a couple hundred calories that have to be used in that process. And it's not coming from the protein, it's coming from what you've previously eaten in the stores in your body to do that. So that you could end up with a metabolic advantage in some cases, assuming that you're still getting adequate intake to fuel all of your training needs. And that's what it comes down to. When we start talking about all of these macros as far as retaining muscle mass, your ability to continue to train with enough intensity and volume to stimulate a hypertrophic response is actually important if you want to hold on to muscle mass. And that's one of the reasons why if your calories go too low, you start losing muscle mass relatively quickly if you're not using drugs to preserve it. And it simply has to do with the fact that you're not getting enough training fuel, and again, your total circulating insulin is going too low, protein's going too low, and your body starts cutting into muscle tissue instead of just body fat further for its needs. But again, what's been noted here, the real factors that seem to matter the most as far as changes, positive changes in body composition during weight loss phases, is ultimately calories and protein. That's your numbers that really matter. Your exact breakdown of carbohydrates and fat, while it can matter for the individual, isn't nearly as important, because the differences in how you fill those remaining calories, unless the protein is starting to get too low, in which case it does matters a lot more. But if the protein is high enough, the way that you choose to fill the remaining calories doesn't matter, because you're not really storing much in the way of body fat anyway. So things like ratios of carbs versus fat just aren't going to affect body composition as much. And multiple studies have looked at that. They found that to be true. When protein intakes start getting pretty high, it doesn't really seem to matter how you fill the remainder of your macros in terms of changes in body composition. The difference is, even from study to study, between how many carbs versus fat you choose to fill it with tends to be relatively small. So ultimately, here's what it comes down to. If you're trying to hold on to muscle tissue the best that you can, if we look at all the available data, you need to keep your protein as high as you can get away with, meaning about as much protein as your budget allows for, as much as you can probably force down within reason, and make sure that you're consuming enough calories to be in a calorie deficit while still having enough energy to fuel your actual training. Because if you're not able to train hard enough to maintain muscle, you will be losing muscle. So again, but a lot of that can be countered by, again, just adding more protein in. It can be a solution if you're not willing to further boost carbohydrates at a certain threshold. But again, there's a lot of debate about this back and forth. But overall, when we look at the studies, it does kind of tend to push in that direction, that when we start arguing how you fill the remainder of your calories, as long as these other two criteria are met, we're controlling calories, we're controlling protein intake, the other stuff is really nuanced, and it is of such minor importance compared to those two that it really isn't something that's worth spending a lot of time debating over. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.